Hello and welcome. My guest today is Oona Hanson. She's a writer, educator, and parent coach who supports families navigating diet culture, including those who have had a child in treatment for an eating disorder. Oona holds a master's degree in educational psychology and a master's degree in English. A regular contributor to CNN, Oona has been featured widely, including on Good Morning America, The Washington Post, USA Today, US News and World Report, People, and Parents Magazine. She writes the Parenting Without Diet Culture newsletter, which I highly recommend. Definitely check it out. And will publish her first book in 2026 with Cambridge University Press. She's a mother of two and lives in Los Angeles. So, Una, thank you so much for joining me today and congrats on your upcoming book.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So the reason starting for listeners, the reason I reached out to you is you wrote this really beautiful piece, this essay in Substack, which I've been finding all these wonderful writers there, and it was really about the title was A Home That Grown Children Want to Visit. And there's a little picture of a nest that you had posted on there, and it was really all about when our children leave home for college or finish high school and move on, how can we create an atmosphere where they actually want to come back and see us again? And a big part of that, obviously, was talking about sort of how to support them, how to not create a critical space or shaming space for them if there have been changes in maybe their bodies or food habits and things like that. So I'd love to just hear kind of the story of that essay and start there.
Yeah, thanks. It's obviously something on my mind because in my age group, I have a lot of friends that are becoming empty nesters. We're close to that ourselves in our family. And because of the work I do, often with parents with younger kids, like tweens and younger teens, I've been thinking about the ways that the diet culture judgments around food and bodies um, kind of take on a new shape or form as our kids become adults. And in researching for my book, I've talked to a lot of people who say, one of the reasons I don't like going home for Thanksgiving, or one of the reasons I try to limit my family reunion time is because I get constant comments about what I'm eating or how I'm exercising or how my body looks. And it's something I just started picking up on from people I either, writers I follow or people I've talked to and interviewed. So I started thinking about the way that this concept of parenting without diet culture, of making a home a safe haven from body shame, food guilt, all of those things, that really can be an important foundation for staying connected with our kids when they become adults. That our home is just that much more welcoming. They feel that unconditional love and acceptance, and that's what really. I mean, that's what I want my kids like feeling when they come home. Not that they're coming purely out of obligation or feeling like it's something they should do or they have to do, but that they actually enjoy being in our company and they know that they don't have to brace themselves for constant criticism or judgment or that kind of like passive aggressive sideways kind of questioning that I think a lot of us have experienced in our own lives where someone says, "Have you thought about this?" Or, the question that it's coming from love. I mean, I'm not going to say that everyone is trying to be critical or negative, but those questions that we realize are really sending a message that like of judgment. And the bottom line is that when our kids are feeling that I mean, as you know, feeling that sense of judgment or criticism from us, that's actually going to make them probably less likely to do the very things that we may be trying to encourage them to do. So kind of the way that our well-intended questions can actually backfire, right? That shame and guilt are actually very demotivating when it comes to self-care. So whether that's body shame, food shame, exercise shame, our well-intended questions can end up kind of going sideways and having the opposite effect. And it's hurting the relationship, which is like the bigger piece of this too.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you brought up, I mean, both guilt and shame. I mean, my book being about guilt, that's really what I've been thinking about and writing about. And I think that we know that it's not get motivating to have these self-critical, guilty thoughts. And the data on self-compassion is pretty clear that actually being kind to ourselves, treating ourselves with compassion is a much better way to motivate. And that's the same when it's working on others or engaging with others. And then shame, really, it's been compared to kind of that fight or flight, almost a runaway, hide, pull ourselves away because we're dealing with that shame in a way of hiding or escaping. And then that can really fracture relationships, right? The opposite of what we're probably trying to do when children come home or when we go to visit family, even as adults. So when you describe sort of diet culture, how would you kind of define that? I mean, I'm sure we all kind of have a sense of what that is, but how would you describe it? And tell us a bit more about why it can be so difficult.
Yeah, I think diet culture is one of those phrases that it is more kind of in the zeitgeist. It's in the everyday vernacular now in a way that it wasn't maybe even 10 years ago. Um, but it is really good to come back and define it. It's an imperfect term, right? I think the term diet culture, people think, oh, if you're not on a diet, you're not participating in diet culture. And that makes sense because the term is a little bit confusing. The reality is that we're all participating in diet culture, probably in one way or another, often without realizing it. It's the, as many others have said, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we're swimming in. And it's a whole system of beliefs around food and bodies and exercise that we have been taught to see as normal or the default, right? So, like any other kind of culture, it's just the assumption that that's what is, that's natural or normal, when in fact it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think what surprises people is that this idea of, foods being in, let's say, a healthy or unhealthy category, right? Good food, bad food, seeing, what is a so-called good body, that those concepts, those aren't innate necessarily, right? That we aren't born with these ideas. These are something we're systematically taught through culture. And I think what really surprises people is to learn more about the roots of diet culture, that it's linked to other systems of oppression, like white supremacy, anti-Blackness, patriarchy. So these big, systemic forces in our world are really intertwined with diet culture. And for folks who want to learn more about that, I highly recommend Dr. Sabrina String's book called Fearing the Black Body. That's a great entry point to recognizing the link between racism, the slave trade, and modern diet culture,
Mm.
and kind of how we put people's bodies in hierarchies, that we see certain bodies as more worthy than others. And this is, obviously a topic that is always coming up in the news, right? I'm not sure when this episode will come out, but I'm sure there will be something in the news that will be raising the question of like who is worthy of care and respect and safety in our world, right? And who gets marginalized or left out or punished or oppressed or ostracized. And diet culture, is one of those threads that kind of reinforces this idea that some bodies are more worthy than others. And I think for families who, want to raise kids to be good citizens in the world, good friends, allies, good bystanders, maybe even upstanders, who really believe in equality and freedom for everyone, understanding diet culture is a really powerful piece of that. These are obviously really big systemic issues. This can be a lot to take in, but the way it often shows up in our everyday lives is just kids being told, eat this, not that. If a kid is in a certain size body, being told that they're not allowed to do certain things or eat certain things, or that they have to move in certain ways. And so we have these really narrow ideas about kind of what we think um, health and well-being look like. And it's really oversimplified. And I think that's really where diet culture is today in our everyday lives. And that's conflating weight and health, like seeing it as this very simple one-to-one correlation or even a causal relationship. It's much more complicated than that. And the same goes with food, right? There's a lot of talk, about foods being like toxic or, poison that are actually safe to eat, right? And meanwhile, actual food safety is being, underfunded. So there's a lot of confusing stuff about health in terms of our nutrition, in terms of our exercise, in terms of our, um, body size. And I think starting to learn about this just brings that awareness that families might realize, oh, I had no idea I was reinforcing something that A isn't even true, but B is could be really harmful to my child in terms of their self-image and their physical health.
Yeah. And I think the curriculum you've written about, even beginning kindergarten on through, and how they talk about healthy eating or talk about certain foods, like can be part of this teaching, that it's not an innate experience that we have, but it's something we learn over time. So, what are some examples of how that might be taught in the schools and how we as parents should think about how do we address that or how do we talk about it with them at home?
Yeah, it's really tough. And I used to be a classroom teacher myself. So I'm like as pro teacher as it comes. So I don't want any of this to come across as being teacher critical.
Yeah,
It's really a criticism of diet culture and the curriculum that often gets handed down to teachers.
yeah.
So we're seeing kids as young as preschool, like 3 and 4 years old, being asked to sort foods into healthy and unhealthy categories, right? Like seeing a picture of a food or a three-dimensional object and putting it into different baskets, or in some cases, gluing pictures onto different paper plates and having like the so-called healthy plate and the unhealthy plate. And these are really young kids. Not surprisingly, age 3 and 4 is where we see kids starting to internalize anti-fat bias, right? They're picking up from media, from their family, from the culture that that they feel differently about someone in a thin body versus in a fat body or a larger body. And I'm using fat as a neutral descriptive term, which it may not, if that's a term that was weaponized against you, as it often is for people in larger bodies, that may not be a term that people, that resonates with them. But I think that's one little thing parents might take away is trying to rethink that word fat, right? Like it's not an F word, right? That it's not a bad word. Now it can be used that way. It can be used in a bullying or cruel or demeaning way, but we can maybe take that term back. Yeah, so really little kids are being told to divide foods into two categories. And what's interesting is the research on that age group in particular is that when kids are told that certain foods are healthy and certain foods are unhealthy, when given free access to all different kinds of foods, kids actually eat less of the foods the adults were trying to pressure them to eat as so-called healthy.
Mm.
So we know it doesn't even actually help kids like try or eat more of those foods that we might think are more nutritious.
Yeah.
Um, and for some kids, it can create this really black and white, rigid thinking and fear around foods. So we know kids are more concrete in their thinking, right? So what sounds like common sense to an adult, to a child can become very scary and rigid. So let's say, cake gets put on the unhealthy plate in the preschool class. Well, an adult's like, well, of course you're going to have cake on your birthday or at a birthday party. But a child is thinking, well, my teacher told me that that's unhealthy and I don't want to be unhealthy and can develop some fear around food. And then, of course, if they're drawn to those foods because the forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest, and they have those foods, maybe even in larger quantities than they would have otherwise, because they're sort of that charge around them, kids can really overdo it, right? I think we've probably all been at the birthday party where you can tell the kid who's never had enough access to kind of a variety of foods isn't engaging in the party activities. They're at, the snack table or the cake table because they feel like this is their one chance to eat those foods and then may be racked with guilt or fear afterward, right? And a stomach ache, probably, right? So, um, these messages that teachers and parents are often giving and doctors, right, of trying to guide kids to eat more of certain foods and less of other foods. It's very well intentioned, but it really backfires in so many ways. So, if we want to zoom out and think about how do I help a kid have a healthy relationship with all foods, one of the things we can do is to move away from labeling or categorizing foods. Unless, if your child has a food allergy or something like that, or celiac, there is a different conversation around what foods are safe for them to eat. But other than that, moving away from labeling foods as a healthy food, or some families are like, oh, that's a fuel food versus a fun food, right? So there have been a lot of kind of like interesting ways of trying to get around that good, bad binary. But kids are really smart and they pick up on that anyway, right? So whether you're calling it good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, fuel, fun, Sometimes, or anytime, sometimes foods. There are all these categories. They end up for most kids having that same effect of seeming very black and white, and that can just really interrupt a child's relationship with food.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here as a parent thinking that that makes sense, but at the same time, my kids would absolutely go and bring out the container of Oreos, and that would be a perfectly fine dinner. You know, how do we support them in learning what actually does help fuel their body, or what is more, even just what is more nutritious, right? Because if something tastes really good and we've got this ubiquity of foods that are ultra processed, are high calorie, are supposed to be, so pleasurable that we keep eating them by design. How do we help them navigate that kind of food landscape that we live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, every family and every kid is different. Some kids have different temperaments, families have different budgets, different values. But I would invite parents to think of a couple of things. One is that concept of habituation, right? And that when kids know that they can have Oreos with their lunch, or they can have Oreos with a glass of milk when they come home from school if they want. When there's access and availability, that forbidden fruit glitter kind of goes down for a lot of kids, right? So if it is reserved as this like once in a while special treat, of course, if they're left alone with that bag of Oreos, that might be like they might eat it all in one sitting, right? So that kind of um, that kind of eating is more likely to happen in the context of restriction. And that's what we see. People feel the most drawn to those kinds of foods and most out of control around certain kinds of foods when there's a history of restriction, either actual restriction because they didn't have access to it for whatever reason, or that mental restriction. So that's where kind of that guilt piece comes in. If people feel guilty about eating something or bad about eating something, it can kind of send that same message, right? That there's something wrong with doing this, that I shouldn't be having this. And again, that can just set someone up for that cycle of like restriction and then even binging out, that kind of restrict binge cycle. And I actually just wrote about this for CNN this week, which is that, eating disorders affect kids who experience food insecurity, right? That restriction might not be a diet or a wellness value around certain foods. It could come from lack of access to foods.
Mm.
And I think that can help people realize that whether it's a restriction from budget or a diet mentality, that this again really can disrupt a child's relationship with food. But on a practical level, I think one framework that can be really helpful for parents is something called the division of responsibility, which is a feeding framework from Ellen Satter. And essentially, it divides the parent's job from the child's job. And that the parent's jobs are to decide what food is served, when the food is served, and where, right? So that's like, are they allowed to eat in the car on the way home from soccer or no, right? Are they allowed to have food in their bedroom or no? So parents are deciding kind of the boundaries around where food is eaten, when it's eaten, meaning there are roughly established set meal and snack times. It's not an all day, grazing situation, which some kids need to do that for a variety of reasons, but for a lot of kids, having structure and expected food times is really helpful. And parents are deciding what food is in the house,
Mm.
right? What food comes home from the grocery store or what food gets ordered on the delivery app or whatever it is, that parents are making those high level food decisions. Of course, we're going to take into account our child's preferences, their individual needs. Some kids do need a lot more calorie dense foods. Some kids have sensory needs that need to be taken into account. So parents aren't just making their decisions based on like, what did the USDA My Plate say I should feed my kids, but you're feeding your kids, right? Not some generic one size fits all nutrition guidance. And then offering a variety of foods to our kids. So knowing that at a mealtime, it's not the clean plate club. You have to eat everything. It's my way or the highway. Instead, you're offering foods that you're pretty sure your kids will like, maybe introducing some new foods now and then, and always having some foods that feel very safe and comfortable for kids too. So it's not about using the division of responsibility to try to force kids to eat certain things. Like There are some people who twist this to sort of starve out a so-called picky eater, and that's not something I would ever recommend. I understand why parents are trying that. They'll think, oh, well, division of responsibility. If I get to decide what is served, I'm only going to serve salmon and steamed broccoli and quinoa, and then kids have to eat it or not. This
Yeah.
is not about trying to make kids go to bed hungry. So the kids' jobs are to eat or not of what is offered. And this can really take a lot of that stress and pressure down on everyone. Now, this is not, again, something that you want to become rigid. I think any approach can kind of be turned into something rigid and harsh. And this is where parents being responsive to their kids' needs is really important. So if, yeah, you try a new recipe at dinner, they really only liked the bread and butter, and they're hungry a couple hours later, right? Responsive feeding, we say, yes, of course, help your child find a bedtime snack or something like that. It's not, well, dinner is over, kitchen's closed, you didn't eat. It doesn't have to be rigid like that. Um, and if you notice your kids are really eager for what, like you mentioned, the Oreos, um, this is an opportunity to try to incorporate them into sort of more ordinary, like maybe it's in their lunch, maybe it's not this once in a while thing. Again, for some families might find that this just becomes this constant battle, and so they might take a different approach. But I think it's really about letting kids know that all foods fit, right? Barring allergies or if someone has religious observance, really helping kids see that foods can be more neutral. Like it's not this is this special snack food, or this is what we have to eat, that kind of thing. And that being said, I think those once a year holiday special foods also are really important too, right? Like I'm not going to make my Christmas cookies 12 months a year. I want them to have that special tie to that time of year. So with all of these things that I'm sharing, I think it's important to see how does it fit into your family, your budget, the style of, how you do dinners. Like maybe your kids are cooking dinner and they're older and maybe they are taking a little bit more of the ownership of the decision making and you're there more in a supporting role. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, my boys, I've been having them try some recipes. We have one of those meal plans that drop off a couple different pieces of the recipe and then that print it out. And they've really enjoyed that and kind of have started taking ownership. It's fun that they're excited, they're choosing the recipes and they're getting to learn how to cook a bit, which is really lovely. So you had written another piece that I really connected with because I am raising two sons, and it was about kind of missing the boys also are challenged by these different things, maybe in different ways or maybe with different goals in mind when it comes to this ideal body. So I'm wondering what we as parents kind of should be watching out for, both raising boys and girls, about some of these different challenges that may come up or things that the children themselves may learn about from peers or coaches or, something on the media.
Yeah, diet culture has really come for boys and men in the last, 20 years, especially maybe in the last 10 years. And so I'm so glad you asked that because often when I meet people and they hear that I work with families whose kids have eating disorders, they'll say, oh, well, I have boys. I'm so glad I don't have to worry about that. And I have to gently educate them that actually,
Yeah.
boys get eating disorders too. Boys have body image concerns too. And now more than ever. I mean, eating disorders don't discriminate. They affect people of all genders, all body sizes, all socioeconomic classes, all races. And I think it's really important for parents to know that their boys are not immune from negative body image. And we can point to so many, factors, whether it's social media, um, you know, big Marvel movie stars, right? If you look at, kind of like
Yeah.
or like what Spider-Man looks like now versus when we were kids, just the extreme muscular images that our boys are seeing.
Hmm.
And that's coming in with this emphasis on like supplement powders. Now protein is like, the it girl of macronutrients right now for everyone, but boys in
Yeah.
particular. I mean, even really young boys. I've been hearing so many stories about, for instance, a family threw a pizza party and one of the boys said, oh, is this Costco pizza? That says X grams of protein per slice. And the fact that this was like an elementary school boy, the fact that boys are thinking about food that way, I think if an 8 or 9 year old girl said, "Oh, that's Costco pizza that has X calories per slice," I think that would raise some alarm bells for parents. But when it's a boy and it's talking about protein or macronutrients,
Mm.
it might kind of fly under the radar. Now, that doesn't mean that boy is developing disordered eating necessarily, but I think it's something parents want to pay attention to. So if boys are cutting things out of their diet, that's that's a point to ask questions, to be curious. Like if they've stopped, again, even if it seems this is going to sound probably shocking to some people, but a boy who says like I want to cut back on dessert because I don't want to eat as much sugar. Well, that sounds like everyone, most adults would say, "Oh, that sounds great. Like I'll do that with you," right? And maybe the doctor said that, maybe the coach said that, maybe the science teacher said that. And the problem is kids who cut things out of their diet without a medical need to do so are at risk of getting into energy deficit, not taking in enough nutrition. There's not enough calories. Kids are growing. And I mean, anyone who's had a boy go through a growth spurt knows they need a lot, and girls too. I don't want to get into that really awful gender stereotype that, you know, boys will eat out of house and home. Well, girls who are growing have a big appetite too. But
Mhm.
since we're focused on boys, just recognizing that cutting foods out can put them at risk. If they're starting to count and track food, again, kids are more concrete in their thinking. A child who is maybe more on the anxious side of things in their approach to life can get really caught up in trying to maximize or optimize. And then in terms of exercise, I mean, exercise, physical activity is so good for us, except when it is at the expense of rest and other activities, or if there isn't enough refueling. So, you know, if you notice that your son, you know, is exercising in a way that just starts to give you that little uh-oh feeling, I think parents should really, really listen to that. Again, I think if it was a daughter doing, you know, workouts in her bedroom late at night or running obsessively or, you know, Stairmaster or whatever it is, I think parents would be like concerned. But when it's a son going to the gym every day, um, you know, that doesn't usually raise any eyebrows. It's like, oh, that's what guys do. It doesn't, again, doesn't mean you have to be panicked or that something is wrong, but it's worth paying attention to and really staying in touch with your son and staying attuned to what is going on. Like, tell me, you know, like maybe go to that gym and check out the vibe, right? Are there grown men there pitching their creatine powders, right, to your son, right? You want to
Mhm.
know what's going on and just kind of paying attention to their relationship with exercise. You know, is their, you know, fitness tracker telling them whether or not they can eat something, right? Are they outsourcing their decision making about things to an app or to an influencer? You know, if you know, even the most elite athletes who are like adolescents, you know, really, if they are like truly going like to the Olympics, so that's probably what tiny percentage of the population, you would want them working with like a true sports nutrition expert, a registered dietitian that knows adolescent development and all of that. But for the average, you know, high school athlete, you really want to pay attention to just how obsessive or how rigid their thinking is around trying to, you know, optimize their performance. Because again, that doesn't sound like dieting. It sounds like fitness. But for a growing child, it can really get them into the same trouble that, you know, a girl counting calories, the same kind of like spiral, right, that can happen. So I think, again, to repeat myself, just to be aware, not to panic, but to be aware and ask our sons to tell us more about, you know, what they like about their sport or what they, you know, whatever the issue is that you're starting to get a little kind of concerned about, just asking them with a lot of compassion and curiosity.
Yeah, just opening up the communication and knowing that, you're there and you want to learn about it, want to talk about it. How would you recommend that a parent might respond if the feedback is, it's fine, I just want to be healthy, this is what everyone's doing, I need this to, whether it's a daughter or son, I need this to perform or to kind of match my peers or friend group. Like, how might you respond to their pushback if you're trying to express at least interest and compassion and concern?
I love that question because that is probably the most common answer. And it's the most common answer you would get from a kid who's developing an eating disorder. Now, again, I'm not diagnosing anyone's kid over over a podcast, and I can't diagnose. I'm not a medical professional. But in my experience working with so many families, the most common origin story for eating disorders right now in the families that I work with is a child who just wanted to be healthy or who just wanted to get faster for cross country or, again, insisting that they're fine or being healthy, that it's a good thing. So if that is your child's response, that is very common. And I think it's worth continuing to ask questions. And if you're, describe the things that you're worried about. And if you're saying, I'm noticing whatever it is, whatever the detail that you're noticing that's worrying you, um, keep asking those questions. A really defensive, angry response from a teenager about their eating or exercise, to me, is almost more sign of trouble,
Mm.
right? Um, if they say, yeah, I mean, like, the coach said maybe we should cut this out. I mean, what do you like if they're kind of loose about it, right? I wouldn't be as worried. Um, so it could be that you reach out to the pediatrician, right? It could be that you go and talk to the coach if the coach is saying these things and kind of get a sense of, did it get lost in translation a little bit? Did the coach make an offhand comment that your child who wants to please their coach is taking to an extreme? And knowing that, the pediatrician's office, um, I mean, I love pediatricians, and this is a very strange time to be like second guessing a doctor because I obviously we're having kind of a public health crisis right now in our country of people questioning medical professionals, but pediatricians get very little training in eating disorders, sometimes just 1 or 2 hours in their entire medical training. And depending on when they got their training, it might have been very outdated information, like thinking it's only thin, white, rich girls who get eating disorders, right? Having some of those myths.
Yeah.
Um, so if you're concerned, but your pediatrician dismisses it based on like, oh, their BMI is fine, or oh, their heart rate's low just because they're an athlete, but you still feel in your gut as a parent that something is wrong, please ask for a referral to an eating disorder professional. That could be a therapist, psychiatrist, a registered dietitian who's experienced with eating disorders. Get a second opinion, because eating disorders aren't, you can't diagnose an eating disorder based on BMI, and a low heart rate, while it can be a sign of, someone who's very physical, like cardiovascularly fit, it can also be extremely dangerous, and can be a sign of a real health risk. So you want to make sure you're getting evaluated by someone who can see the whole picture, and not base it on maybe that 1 hour of medical training from 20 years ago. Um, and again, pediatricians are doing their best. And unfortunately, because eating disorders have become more common, more and more doctors are aware and are taking these concerns really seriously. So I'm hoping this is happening less. But I worked with so many families who really had to push back against a doctor's reassurance that, I took their labs are fine. Labs being fine is not a way to rule out an eating disorder.
Mhm.
Um, so it doesn't mean you're questioning the doctor, you're just asking for a little bit more information and maybe getting a specialist involved if you're still feeling that gut feeling that something is wrong.
I think one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing to speak with you is just how, parents are trying to manage these concerns in their kids. When I was taking care of children on a psychiatric unit, a lot of it was how do we train the parents? How do we help them understand what's going on? But also how do we help reassure them or help them manage their guilt that they should have taught them differently or should have protected them in some way? Or I think a big one, certainly I think about this and both moms and dads, but women facing the body image issues who may have struggled themselves and are now parents and they worry they're passing that along. Like I imagine that's a big part of the work you're doing with parents is how can I both be compassionate toward myself and what maybe work I've done, but still be present for my child and recognize that this has happened in this culture we're in.
Yeah. And specifically with eating disorders, there's such a history of blaming parents, especially mothers.
Mm,
And again, there are still practitioners today who were trained on that approach of like, oh, it's this anxious mom. Let's get this kid and send them off to, let's get them out of this toxic home environment. Like there were all these
hmm.
really harmful beliefs about eating disorders and some other conditions too, right? That we now, like whether it's schizophrenia or, there are other
Yeah.
mental health conditions that used to be blamed on like, a cold mother or an overly involved mother, like basically anything a mother did was wrong. So
Yeah.
luckily that's like, we know that's not the case, but that myth persists, and I think in our culture, even among some professionals. So it's also, I think I can imagine that a child becoming ill with anything, parents often wonder, what could I have done differently? And I think that's a very natural response. But when it's eating disorders, there's sort of this extra layer of thinking other people are going to judge you. So I myself had been in this situation. I had a child develop an eating disorder. It went on for a year almost
Mm,
before we actually got the right diagnosis and knew what was going on because I didn't know what eating disorders actually looked like, right? And again, they don't look like something, but I didn't recognize that
yeah.
this was happening because I had these myths, right, of what it would be. Um, and I felt incredibly guilty, right? I have a master's in ed psych. I used to teach high school students and I coached high school students. So I know, a decent amount about adolescent development and some mental health issues. So I really felt racked with guilt for a while, right? That how could I, of all people, miss this? And I've come to learn that eating disorders are so sneaky, diet culture is so pervasive that if you don't know what you don't know. So, if this is happening in your family, it's really about getting the support, acknowledging, yeah, it makes sense to feel bad, but parents don't cause eating disorders, and parents can actually be the most powerful source of support for recovery. Yes, you're probably going to need to bring in, a team to support, but parents can play a really big role in that. And I've seen in my own life and with the families I've worked with, parents make just have incredible growth around understanding diet culture, around maybe coming to terms with their own body image or food struggles. And it doesn't mean you have to suddenly like wake up and you're this perfectly intuitive, relaxed eater who loves their body. Like that's not a requirement to help your child. um, and if it were, no one would recover from an eating disorder because almost no one has that rather mythic perfect body image and relaxed relationship with food. Um, so I do think though, and I wrote a piece about this as well, specifically for moms, about kind of going through perimenopause or these big life changes while you have a child going through puberty and adolescence, that it might feel like the perfect storm, like hormones are doing things that we're not used to, bodies are doing weird things unexpectedly, or maybe they should be expected if we knew more. But I think it's actually a perfect opportunity to model, how we navigate body changes, that we don't have to necessarily pretend that like, oh, we're all beautiful. All bodies are beautiful. Like teenagers are like, well, okay, you might believe that, mom, but like the reality is you get treated differently based on how you look. And being able to have those conversations and then talk about the healthy ways you cope with that. So, one practical example is having clothes that fit you comfortably. And I think, we're used to our kids growing out of clothes, but adults grow out of clothes too. And normalizing that. And you can normalize, yeah, it stinks when your favorite thing doesn't fit anymore, right? Like acknowledge that little bit of grief or discomfort, and also showing how that's part of life because our kids aren't done changing once they go through puberty and adolescence, right? Their bodies are going to continue to change, whether that's going off to college or having their own family or just aging or having any kind of medical situation that changes your body. Yeah, body changes are here to stay. So the earlier we can kind of have that opportunity to talk to them about that, normalize it, and again, talk about the healthy ways to cope with that change, right? That it's that trying to constantly fight your body or control it or shrink it, that doesn't tend to really enrich our lives or our health, right? It ends up really taking away, in my opinion, from a full life. That's not to say we don't take care of ourselves, right? In fact, kind of as we were talking about earlier, when we respect and love our bodies, not for how they look, but just for getting us through our day and our life, we're more likely to take care of it, right? So there's so many opportunities to be role models. And again, we don't have to be perfect. There can be a little fake it till you make it sometimes. I think that, you might have the thought about how something looks on your body, but you don't have to verbalize it to your kid, right? You might have, yeah, the negative thought before, we're taking holiday family photos or kind of those moments, right? Or it's a family wedding, or there's something where there's sort of like a lot of pictures are being taken. There's a lot of appearance pressure. Those moments can be tough, and getting support for yourself. If really you're finding that you're struggling, I think parents supporting their own healing around this stuff is often the most powerful thing we can do for our kids.
I'm laughing as you're describing this because I just recently went through my closet thinking, okay, I needed to prepare and find some outfits that are dressier for book release events and such. And so much of it I had not worn for, I don't know, at least 5, maybe 10 years. And a lot of it didn't fit very well. My body has changed, and it was a real process. And being able to say, like, change is inevitable. The only thing that we can really count on is change, which I wrote about in my book in a number of different places. But it's just that you needing to remind yourself and be compassionate and know that it is hard when you see those changes, because when you're going through puberty, some of these are exciting, right? You're getting taller, you're just becoming more of an adult looking person. But the perimenopause and menopausal stages and changes are more difficult, I think, in some ways, because the shifts are maybe those that we're not as excited about. Yeah. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I love the writing that you're putting out there, especially I was going to end with a quote that you had written in the story about inviting your adult kids home. And it said, "What a gift we can give a fledgling adult, a place where their bodies and food choices aren't under scrutiny, where they are always loved just as they are." And I thought that was such a beautiful, beautiful line. So, Una Hansen, thank you for the work you're doing. I'm so excited to check out your book when it comes out. Hopefully, I can have you come back on and talk about it. And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.